I work so hard at technique to try to make it as easy as possible.
As soon as you come in and things are in tune and in time, like you were officially at zero, now the work starts. Now like the actual interesting parts start.
I always try to come from a place of love and joy and then go from there. The other stuff's easy.
Welcome to Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here today, and check out everything we've been doing for the past decade plus at contrabassconversations.com. Send me a message. Is this the first episode you've ever listened to? Have you been listening for years at this point? I'd love to hear from you, and that email address is feedback@contrabassconversations.com. Now, today's episode is a different sort of episode. If you're new to the show, this is not our norm, but I love putting these compilation episodes together. Today's episode is a deep dive into the concept of technique, abstract technique, what we work on each and every day on the instrument, both to stay in shape physically and to keep moving forward in terms of our skill development. Technique is one of the most common topics on the podcast and has been so since the beginning. So I thought doing a deep dive on this would be great. And you already heard snippets from Cleveland Orchestra principal bassist Max Dimmoff, Houston Symphony principal bassist Robin Kesselman, and Indiana University bass professor Kurt Muroki. We're going to be taking excerpts from episodes ranging from just about a month ago to the very first interview ever done for Contrabass Conversations. So in addition to those three, you're going to be hearing from Los Angeles Philharmonic bassist Jerry Herman, former Academy of St. Martin in the Fields principal bassist Leon Bosch, National Symphony bassist Ira Gold, Lyric Opera of Chicago bassist Andrew Anderson, University of Michigan Professor Emeritus Diana Gannett, Chicago Symphony bassist Michael Ovnanian, Butler University bass professor David Murray, University of North Texas bass professor Jeff Braditich, Jerusalem Academy of Music faculty member Michael Klinghoffer, New York Philharmonic bassist David Grossman, Cincinnati Symphony principal bassist Owen Lee, Berlin Philharmonic principal bassist Matthew McDonald, University of Illinois professor Larry Gray, and Ithaca College bass professor Nicholas Walker. What a privilege to have been able to chat with these and the other hundreds of people that I've chatted with for the podcast. I think you're really going to enjoy digging into these concepts. And if you'd like to hear the complete interview of any of these 17 people that I'm putting together, I've got links in the show notes to all of their individual episodes. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, you'll also probably enjoy checking out my other compilation episodes, which include Fitness in the Bass, that came out the end of 2016, as well as my Winning the Audition 4-part series, which is also a book as well. The links to all of that are in the show notes. And I'd like to take a moment before we get started and thank our longtime sponsor, D'Addario Strings. I'd love to have you enter our Kaplan string giveaway. D'Addario is going to be giving away 10 sets of Kaplan strings. You can visit contrabassconversations.com/strings to enter. Now, Kaplan strings are stranded steel core strings that provide clarity and warmth in all registers. They're versatile, got great control through the dynamic spectrum, rich tonal color palette, superb bow response, and they're beautifully balanced. And several of my past guests have used Kaplans and are using Kaplans, including Anthony Stoops, Andres Martin, Klaus Freudenstein, Craig Butterfield, Daniel Kimbrough, David Allen Moore. The list goes on and on. Check them out at D'Addario.com, and thank you for sponsoring the podcast. I'd also like to thank Rosin Saver, which is a revolutionary storage device that keeps bass rosin feeling as fresh as the day it was made. It was developed in Sweden by a pair of professional bassists and Rice graduates. And what makes bass rosin so soft and sticky is the addition of natural waxes and solvents. And as these evaporate, your rosin becomes dry, powdery, and useless. I'm sure you know that feeling. So Rosin Saver prevents this by completely saturating the air surrounding your rosin. So the rosin feels great and sounds great, regardless of the weather outside. And it's used by myself. I'm loving it. I've been using it for several months. And members of the New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, Los Angeles Philharmonic, Cleveland Orchestra, Seattle Symphony, and many others. If you go to rosinsaver.com and enter the promo code HEATH, that's HEATH, at checkout, you get 10% off any and all orders. Thank you for sponsoring the podcast. And again, rosinsaver.com, promo code HEATH. Okay, let's dive into technique. What, when, and why are the three questions that come to mind. What are we practicing? When are we doing it? And why are we doing it? So let's start with Jory Herman of the Los Angeles Philharmonic and the when of technique practice.
Some people, preach by waking up in the morning and doing their bass playing, getting any sort of technique work or warm-ups or calibration sort of thing right off of the bat. Or some people love to do their work at the very end of the day, whether it's, the creative side of things, if they need to improvise or if they need to compose, doing something as they're, kind of almost drifting off into to sleep sort of thing. So it's, find what works best for you and, etch that out into your own schedule and try to hold on to it.
Okay, you find that time that works well for you. Maybe it's the morning, maybe it's the afternoon, the evening. I love how Jory describes kind of the technique work in the morning and the creative work in the evening. That's definitely how I've been ever since I can remember. But what are you practicing with that time? Ira Gold describes how technique has always been the primary focus for him.
Most of the time I spent in school, and even now, most of the time I have to practice. That's what I'm doing. I think the biggest challenge is resisting the temptation to want to just kind of let it all go when you have the instrument in hand. And we all have that basic urge to want to just play. We want to just express and communicate, and we always want to live in that final stage of performance and that feeling of like delivering. But we have to remember that we still have a craft to take care of.
So how do we take care of that craft? Here's a quote I love from Leon Bosch describing how he organizes his practice time. And this is the way I've been organizing my practicing, my podcasting, my blogging, my everything in life pretty much. I love this technique. Check it out from Leon.
I began to realize that there was something physiological taking place. Mm-hmm. Because when I started practicing, I couldn't do something. But I persevered. I would take one thing at a time and try to master it. And usually by the end of the day, I had a particular habit. I had a way in which I worked. I worked intensely for 20 minutes. And then I'd leave the room, go away, sit down, think about it, and come back to it 20 minutes more. I didn't work absolutely nonstop. I had concentrated periods. But they lasted all day. And I was always in that room, the room B17, which was the bass room. And I began to realize that there was a moment where something clicked, and suddenly I could do it. And then I insisted every day that I wouldn't leave the room till something magical had happened. Something new that I couldn't do had suddenly become possible. And looking back now, it was this whole process of myelinization that I discovered. I knew that I was developing instinctively, or without being able to quantify what was going on. I somehow discovered that there were new neural pathways that were being encouraged and being enhanced.
What Leon's describing is the process of myelination, which is an actual physical change that happens in the brain as you begin to do this kind of deep practice. And there's a wonderful book called The Talent Code. If you haven't read it, you really should be required reading, really, for any musician, in my opinion, and especially anybody who teaches at all. Check that out in the show notes. And we're diving into next, is sort of with the idea of mindfulness and how the brain is working during processing. We've got a couple quotes, one from Andy Anderson and one from Rob Knopper, both talking about to what degree and how your brain is engaged as you're practicing.
I've told probably more students than I should that one of the best ways to learn spiccato is to, watch the Star Wars trilogy and bounce your bow the whole time. I'm one of the few people that advocates, getting your mind off what you're doing so your body can figure out how to do it. Kind of. There's this kind of weird combination of learning a difficult technique like that where you kind of are thinking about what you're doing, but if you think about it too much, you tense up and then you can't do it. So there's this sense that you kind of have to forget about what you're doing. You kind of have to let your body take over and find a relaxed way to do it without thinking about it. And yet that's the problem, is when you're learning something new, you have to be thinking about it. So, I spent a lot of time in a dark room by myself in the music school just bouncing my bow for hours. I remember there was at least 3 Saturdays that I spent a good 6 hours just playing one note over and over and over, bouncing my bow, trying to figure out how it works. it was almost like meditation. You know, you have this kind of dorky idea of a bunch of monks sitting around going, Om. You know, that's basically what I was doing with a bass, except instead of that, I was going, you know, for hours on end.
Why be embarrassed about watching TV while you play? It works so well for me. Like, I'll focus in on what I'm doing, and then I'll zone out, and like my hands will start to adapt to whatever thing I'm trying to get them to get used to, right? And the muscles will start to build, and they'll get more comfortable. And if I'm constantly staring straight at them, trying to focus, it just gets boring, and I don't improve as fast.
Now we're getting into the what of practicing. And these next few abstract technique exercises, I was introduced to them, most of them anyway, by Jeff Raditich back in 1991, I think. And I've been doing some variant of these pretty much every day ever since. The first one we're digging into are, you can call them shifting drills, you can call them vomit exercises, whatever you'd like to call them. They're associated with Gary Carr, and here's a bit about them from Max Dimoff of the Cleveland Orchestra.
Every morning at 9 o'clock, we would start with this routine, and the very first thing we did was what Gary called vomit. People might know it as vomit, or it's just a shifting exercise, where you just play all the finger combinations, 2 octaves up and down, and it's quite a difficult exercise in itself. And watching Gary do this every morning, and I've got to say that the whole thing took about an hour and a half, you know, what we did in the class. And Gary would play it with us. And watching this guy who I considered a living legend to do this, he was probably in his mid-40s at the time. And it made such an impact on me that he was still practicing that way and doing this sort of thing every day, that I made a commitment to myself that I would do that. I wanted to be like that for the rest of my life, and it really has had the most positive impact on my playing, and just the commitment and the discipline involved in doing that. You know, that's been the most important thing for that. So now, to this day, I actually got up this morning at 7 o'clock, got my kids ready for school, and took them to school, and then I started on my warm-up. I like to start at 7. Today our concert was a little bit later, so I actually started at 8 o'clock this morning. So, and I started very first thing with vomit.
So you just start with that exercise then? That's the first
I do.
thing?
It's a great warm-up exercise. It not only gets the blood going in your fingers, but you can think about pulling out a big sound. It warms up the instrument too, which I think is very important. You know, if you've ever played when your bass is very cold, everything sounds tight, and then you tend to want to press because you want to get a big sound, but you can't really get a big sound because your instrument's not open up enough yet. And so it allows me to do that. I think about things now. When most people do that exercise when they start out, they're just trying to get the shift in tune. And I certainly was doing that when I started for many years, actually. It's been 24 years I've been doing this now. But now I tend to think about things more like, for myself, like posture and breathing and even weight distribution on my feet, since I stand when I play. So those are the things I think about. And of course, you know, pulling out a good sound and keeping everything relaxed. But the actual intonation of it is sort of secondary almost.
Here is some info on the background of these exercises, where Gary Carr got them from, and how he adapted them for bass players. And this is with Diana Gannett, who is Gary Carr's former teaching assistant.
Well, he spent time working on those warm-ups with George Bornoff, who's a violin pedagogue. And you'll sometimes hear other people doing vomits on their string instruments, you know, because it's a Bornoff technique. And so it was very well thought out pedagogy. And I really find them very, very useful. When I was still at Yale, we would do them every day, I think for at least an hour. And when I taught at Oberlin, every single morning, we did them every morning and got so much done. It was a quick way to get a lot of concepts across, and a good way to focus on how am I playing, you know, and how do I get a sound, and how do I relax while I'm playing, and how do I shift, and what is my body doing? You know, because most of our training is watching the page, which of course is terrible on your neck, watching the page and interpreting the page.
Michael Klinghoffer also worked quite a bit with Gary Carr, and here's some of his thoughts on how you should be thinking about using the left hand or not using the left hand, as he likes to put it, during these exercises.
The thing is not to use any energy in the left hand mostly to hold the bass. And just like violinists, they don't hold the violin with their left hand. And if they do, that's the reason for pressure, that's the reason for tendinitis, that's the reason for a lot of problems.
Okay, one more thought on the vomit exercises, the shifting drills, from David Murray, another former Gary Carr student.
Pretty much everything was focused on the bow. Because, Gary was all about sound, bow control, sound. And, a lot of people treat vomit as a shifting exercise. Gary never really talked about that. He talked about the bow. Anything to do with the left hand, we talked about that after the fact, but he always talked about the bow control first. And vomit is still something I share with my students, too. I mean, everything to do with the bow, balance of the bass, and, of course, the way you shift is affected by all of that as well. And even intonation, you can certainly treat it as partly as an intonation thing, but primarily it's a bow exercise. So the idea of playing close to the bridge with a relaxed arm so you have weight, using the muscles in the back to draw the bow is first and foremost with that exercise. One of the other exercises we call turds. It's thirds, right. You do basically an F major scale in thirds. So you play F on the D string, A on the G string, and you go up between the D and the G strings in the key of F. And so that's for string crossing. It's two notes slurred, like F-A slurred, F-A separate bows, F-A slurred up bow, and then separate bows. Then you go on to G-B flat. And we start that slowly, and that's for string crossing. So again, it's all about the bow, thinking about how the arm moves from one string to the other, a nice uniform motion, not letting the wrist, be loose. But again, with the whole arm moving together. And I learned so much about the bow, right away.
Digging into some other exercises that people do every day that I've done every day, we're bringing you Jeff Braditich, who is the person that I discovered these exercises from, and Jeff describing the routine that he put together, how he's applied it to students, and note fragments. And some of these audio excerpts are from about a decade ago, and I'm much better at recording audio now in 2017 than I was at this point. So excuse some of the audio variables in these excerpts, but you can still hear it. It's great content nevertheless. Here's Jeff.
There's just certain basics to sound production that everybody has to know. And whether you're the beginner or you're the most advanced, there's still concepts that just you can teach to everybody at the same time. And that's part of the exercise routine. We apply that then, to scales and of course the shifting drill that Gary Carr made famous by calling it vomits. I hope it sounds better than that, but it does. It's a great exercise for developing shifting, and everybody can do it at the same time. So you have a class situation that way, and then most of our music is divided into 3 and 4 note patterns. Whether we realize it or not, we're playing da-da-dee, da-da-da, dee-da-da, be-da-da, things like that, or ba-da-da-da-dee, ba-da-da-da-dee, dee-da-da-da-da, 3 and 4 patterns all over the place all the time. And so I've set up a routine of progressive scales using 4-note patterns, and then a whole other set using 3-note patterns, both in the lower positions where we play most of the time, but also same patterns, but a little bit different concept in thumb position. And you learn it in one key, but then you can apply it to every key.
Here's Max Dimoff also talking about progressive scales, these 3 and 4 note fragments, but also Max's magic, or rings thing is what Max originally called it. It's a dexterity exercise that I've done for years. I've taught countless students. Here's Max describing these 2 exercises.
Ring Warner showed me that exercise. He was a bass player in the Seattle area when I was in high school. That was actually the very first exercise that I ever learned. I called it Ring's thing because Ring showed it to me. And Jeff Braditich came up with a fancier name called Max's Magic. And it's actually it's just a little finger pattern, 1 2 4 2 1 4 2 4, just repeated 4 times on each note, starting on F on the E string. And I found that after doing that exercise for a short amount of time, I developed a very fast trill. So that's kind of a curious thing about that. You know, when you look at it, when you look at your arm, you can really see the tendons moving, and back by the elbow, and that's where the trills come from. And I developed a very, very fast trill by doing that. I had a student a couple of years ago who had this blazing fast trill in his upper register, and I asked him, where did that come from? And he said that he took that exercise and took it up one more octave. And so I got to say, actually, this morning I was thinking about that while I was doing that, and I took it up the extra octave. So you certainly learn from your students. And I grouped that one in with two other exercises, just a 4-note pattern in slurs, just a da 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 da, and then a 3-note pattern, da 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 da.
Okay, these are some of the practicing techniques, abstract technique exercises that so many of us do. Max, Jeff, myself, countless others. Why do we do them? What are they good for? Here's Max again on that topic.
All the exercises, they're sort of designed, at least in my mind, to really build strength, stamina, flexibility, and sort of suppleness in the fingers and the bow and in the left hand, and really attacks, I would say, 95% of what I see on a daily basis.
That's basically the technique that I practice, in addition to various scales and permutations. We'll get into that in a bit. But I wanted to go through two other routines that people do. You're going to hear from Kurt Muroki, the Indiana University bass professor, wonderful solo player, and Larry Gray from the University of Illinois, fabulous jazz player. Interviewed them both in the past. They have thoughts on their specific routines and what they do. Here's Kurt and then Larry.
The first thing that I do is I move my fingers, and I go for sensitivity first. So the more sensitive I am, the more I can interact with the instrument. I try to befriend the instrument. I try to treat it as a friend, which means opening it up sound-wise. I work on, even before I touch the bass, I always try to make sure that my brain is in the right place before I practice. I think that's the most important thing. The mind is a terrible thing and a wonderful thing. It can either hamper you and shut you down, or it can help you to move forward. So I always like to make sure that I'm coming from the positive. I always try to come from a place of love and joy. The two hardest emotions to find in music are love and joy. And I try to find that first, and then go from there. The other stuff's easy. I have specific exercises I do. Double stops, great. Making sure that I have fingering patterns. I like to practice trill exercises, playing a double stop and then trilling with the third finger, whatever finger is the third finger. So double stops plus trills. I work on double stops are great because they not only works on getting the bow arm to really be in the right plane, but it also allows me to color my sound. So, for example, if I do a double stop, I can either make it dark or bright. I mean, those are the extremes. I can weight it to the D, like if I'm doing the D and G strings, I can weight it to the D string, I can weight it to the G string for a double stop. And then I work on double stop scales. Again, these are my exercises for myself.
Sure.
So as I'm going through double stop scales, I start, if I'm playing low to high, I start dark and I go to bright. Or I go from bright and go to dark sound in double stop scales. I work on intervals. We do a lot more intervals than we do linear playing. So interval training. And I work on vibrato every day. Vibrato, spiccato. Spiccato is fleeting, and the reason why spiccato is fleeting is because it's and this is the explanation Larry Hurst gave me, and I agree with him 100%. He's, again, I don't think I've ever heard a wrong thing from Larry. He's awesome. God, he's opened up my mind a lot. But violinists have it easy because gravity pulls straight down. So the spiccato is, you learn how to do it and you're done. It's true. Bass spiccato, we're not working with gravity as much. We're working sideways. So spiccato is fleeting. So I agree with that. and vibrato, because I find that vibrato allows me to create the right amount of resistance for the bow.
I have something I call a basic warm-up, which introduces, basically, it's really 4 components of technical approach to the instrument. It tries to reduce it to the most basic rudimental level. In other words, more basic than playing scales, because by the time we play scales, we're combining several elements at the same time, whether we're playing them pizzicato or arco. So the areas are arco, right-hand sound production, right-hand pizzicato sound production, shifting, finger dexterity, and that's 4. And the 5th one is just a sort of a wild card section. It's really just something real specific about string crossings. It has to do, Jason, with maintaining a consistent angle, like you're seeing keeping the same angle of the wrist as we go across all 4 strings. Like a lot of bass players, they will do this sort of thing as they move to different strings. And when we play the same finger across all 4 strings in the same position, we learn to move from the elbow. And so that to me is a very important part. And of course, like, it's big muscle motions. It's really where everything is in motion. So if I'm in a fixed position and I'm going to move the smallest unit to get to these other notes, then that to me is not as good a strategy as to think about I'm going to move from a bigger place and do what's appropriate and what feels best, for a particular region on this gigantic instrument that we're playing.
I think that concept of what you do before you practice scales is so valuable because, like so many people talk about in this compilation episode, as soon as you're practicing scales, you're actually practicing several variables at once. And just simply practicing open strings is something that I've had guests talk about multiple times. Here's Ira Gold on just practicing open strings.
Recently, I've been starting every practice session with just playing open strings. The first thing I do is tune, and then I just play open strings, and sometimes I just play long tones like an oboist does. Sometimes I'll do slurs and string crossings. It doesn't matter what it is, but I just want to hear the sound of the bass just making an open sound, and until I even start doing anything else. You can always reduce everything that we do to a single idea or a single concept. So I like to kind of isolate that.
Speaking of hearing the bass making an open sound, I love this incredibly poetic quote from Berlin Philharmonic principal bassist Matthew McDonald.
Just playing long notes, trying to get the bass to resonate more and more, and seeing where this point is, where the bass almost seems like you can almost see light coming out of it, where the overtones are so strong that you can almost see it.
Michael Klinghoffer also talks about sound and just starting with creating sound and how sound and the beauty of sound is of primary importance to him.
First of all, the sound. And I will start with my personal thing, which is kind of an axiom that there is or there should be expression in the very sound. Before we even play a melody, just the sound has to be expressive. The sound has to touch somewhere. You hear different recordings. I remember an experience I had in Paris. There was a street player. He played some Japanese instrument or Chinese one-string bowed instrument, and the sound was so amazing. Forget the melody. The melody is not important. It was about the sound. So on the philosophical level, this is what I believe in, that there is expression in the very sound, or there should be. Now, about the sound in general, what I try to do is let the instrument resonate. Let the instrument resonate. We don't need to use force. The sound happens because energy is released, not because we do something. We have our arm weight into the string, and then we start moving, and we can't move because the arm is too heavy. And if we slowly release the weight, then the bow will start moving. Just like in the pizzicato, you accumulate energy and you release it. It's not like in percussion, where you do something and you get a sound immediately. The sound in percussion is a result of what you do. With the bow, it's different. It's the energy that you accumulate and then release.
after I practice these technical exercises that I basically do every day, these ones that we've been describing, I get into scales, and I do some sort of scale practice every day. I thought it'd be helpful to hear a few quotes from David Grossman of the New York Philharmonic and Owen Lee of the Cincinnati Symphony about how they practice scales.
I tell my students, for whatever reason, if you only have an hour a day, practice scales. I have a specific regimen I have them do that's basically an hour long of scales and arpeggios, and a way of practicing with vibrato, and the note values getting smaller, into eighth notes, triplets, sixteenths, etc., 16th note triplets, even faster. And basically, I feel, if you can play, a scale around 70 to the quarter note, and you're playing, 7 notes like an octave a beat, with slurs, then, the separate notes aren't quite as difficult.
I still, to this day, sort of start off my practice with scales and arpeggios, through from 3 octaves. Basically you want to have a command of the fingerboard from the nut all the way to the end of the fingerboard. So scales and arpeggios in 3 octaves through all 12, major, or I should say 24 major and minor keys. So I do that to this day, and I think it's a great way to just keep the blade sharp, because scales and arpeggios it's like tuning the piano, But unfortunately, we have a piano that needs to be tuned every day.
So much of practicing really is problem solving. It's like solving a puzzle, coming up with solutions. You're not sure what the path is and just trying to discover that. And that's something that we've talked about several times on the podcast. So here are a few snippets from David Grossman, from Max Demoff, and from Michael Klinghoffer on the puzzle of practicing and solving problems.
If it's not happening, remember, it's either a left-hand problem, a right-hand problem, or a coordination of them. And it kind of cracks me up because it sounds very obvious, but as a student, it's very helpful to hear that and remind yourself.
Everybody, to some degree, has had an experience where they take something and put a bowing pattern to it. Like a really common one is a dotted pattern. And it's a good way to practice, but I sort of took that really to an extreme. There's a book by Ivan Galamian called Violin Technique. In the back of that book, there's a supplementary book with every conceivable bowing and rhythm pattern. And he actually says, you can continue on in this fashion because you can't really write them all down, every permutation of that. So I would start to take, I think I started doing it with excerpts first, say like Mozart 35. In the last movement, and say like the top of the third page, and I would take like a 16-note bowing pattern or a 16-note rhythm pattern, and then put them together. Actually, the 16-note patterns on that particular one are pretty easy. When you have obvious groups of 4, I like to do patterns of 5 over that because you lose the bar lines at that point, and it's kind of like ironing out all your technique, because you're not going to get stuck here because your mind's thinking bar line, and or you don't put an accent there. A lot of times you have a down bow, put an accent because you have all the natural weight working for you, and so it's easy to do that. So I like to try to work through that and work out all those little bumps. And I find, especially with bowing patterns, as far as that's concerned, anything with the bow is going to be evened out pretty easily. And rather quickly too. It's a very efficient way to work. I remember Edgar Meyer telling me a long time ago that he would just practice slow with a metronome. So I remember thinking, well, if it's good enough for Edgar, it's good enough for me. And so I started doing that all the time. And that's a very, very effective way to practice. But it's a little more time consuming, and it's easy to sort of shut your mind off when you do that. When you're doing these bowing patterns, and I should say I still do slow practice. It's not like I've abandoned that. I think it's a fantastic way to practice. But you're really going to cement everything that you're working on when you do it that way. So you should make sure that you're doing everything correctly when you do that. With the bowing patterns and the rhythm patterns, it's a really quick way, and it keeps your mind really engaged, because when you have this little problem to solve, say you have a 9-note pattern over groups of 4, everything's going to be off all the time. And I remember working on the first cello suite when I was getting ready for the Cleveland audition, and putting it to a metronome and doing the 9 and the 7-note patterns. And I would have to put asterisks in my part where the where the metronome lined up with the bar line, and I wasn't always right. It's easy to get lost in that. When I practice that, I don't practice to try to be perfect with that necessarily, but to sort of see the pattern. And when you can sort of feel the pattern and see the bigger picture of it, then I move on to the next one when it starts to begin to feel easy.
The concept is that many of the things we do, we're doing them in kind of an automatic pilot mode. And we're not really thinking what we're doing. If I drive the main highway here from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and my family calls, will you be on time for dinner? I have to think where I am because I'm driving automatically. Right. But if I'm in the United States and I have to drive in a place where I don't know, I really follow and I listen to the GPS and I, not to make mistakes. So when we do the stop bow practicing, we're actually moving out of automatic pilot. We are thinking, okay, now I have to do this. Now the bow goes here. Now the left hand comes to place. Now I play. I end the note where the next note starts. Now the left hand comes into place. Now I play.
Another topic is what we're doing in addition to just playing the bass to enhance our practicing and recording and playing for other people. We talked about that so many times in Winning the Audition. You can go back and listen to a few dozen of our past guests talk about how they record, how they play for other people. And I want to share a couple of clips, another one from David Grossman, but first one from Michael Hovnanian about using a tuner to just take your intonation to the next level. I spend a fair percentage of every practice session with a drone on, a tuner playing a note. These days I use my iPhone and a very loud app called Tonal Energy. Back in the day, I carried a couple of speakers and a tuner and was changing batteries constantly. However you do it, using a drone is great, and using a tuner that gives you some feedback is great. So here's Michael and then David.
When I was in Victoria, I also bought my first tuner and started to really practice for, to try and play in tune, like down there in the half position.
I was just so tired of playing out of tune. One day I just had it up to here. I don't know if it's because I was used to hearing a piano. I wasn't going to settle for it anymore. And so I put a tuner. I got a tuner that could generate a tone. So it was creating a drone. And I just practiced with that thing, and just really slowly for a couple hours. So I guess I have a number of suggestions, that being one of them for my students. But the main thing I would say is just don't settle for anything and you're playing that you don't want there. It's not just going to get better by itself. And if it's out of tune or it doesn't sound good to you, believe me, it doesn't sound good to anyone else.
The last clip I'd like to share today is what I think of as the epitome of an abstract practice world, and that's Domaine Forget. This is Nicholas Walker, Ithaca College bass professor and the president-elect of the ISB, also the convention host for the 50th anniversary convention. Nicholas is describing what it's like practicing in the morning with the 25 or so bass students and what they go through. And just picture yourself in this scenario and how they approach abstract technique and how it develops through the weeks while they're at Domaine Forget.
At 8:30, we all meet in the main room in the barn. It's about 25 students and the two of us, and we do a little body work and we do a big hour and a half workout together. So, we do some, it's sort of changed from stretching to yoga to Feldenkrais to Alexander stuff to Pilates to anything that's sort of in our group awareness that year. Sometimes there's a specialist there, sometimes it's a very generalized thing, but we all do a little bit of get our bodies ready because we go hard for a long time, so you have to really care for yourself. And then we work out. We introduce concepts. We teach about, everything from shifting and bowing exercises to specific left-hand techniques and fingering patterns and etudes and exercises. Everything is done by ear and by rote. There's no music stands in front of anyone. There's no distractions. We're in a big circle, and we just throw it out at them super fast and hardcore. I mean, we go, by the time we've done our 2 weeks, we have an hour and a half routine that we do without stopping of playing. That's one exercise after another. So, but it doesn't start like that. We sort of teach these things, all the stuff that like Sev-check bowing variations and open string patterns and shifting exercises and hand frames and drop thumb and expansion and pivot things and hammer on and pull offs and all, just a huge list of stuff. And then we little by little collate that into an organized sequence, I guess you call it like a rigorous daily routine. By the way, all of these things aren't just things that we have decided ahead of time. They come from, we meet with the students the first night before we begin and we ask them their goals and we take notes and everyone talks about the stuff that they want to learn. So if Beethoven's 7-stroke is in there, then that's part of what we're dealing with in that case.
Well, that's going to do it for this deep dive on technique. I hope you enjoy these. They take a fair bit of work to put together. That's an understatement. And do you like these? Do you find these valuable? Let me know. feedback@contrabassconversations.com. If you like them, what topics would you be interested in hearing? I would love to put these out more frequently, and I could probably, honestly, not in terms of the time that I have in my life, but in terms of the content and the wealth of content, I could put one of these out each week and never run out of topics to cover. We've covered so many great topics. So are you enjoying these? Would you like me to keep doing these? I enjoy them. It's kind of like putting together a 50-page research project or some sort of equivalent to do one of these. I think it's a great thing for the community. But if you enjoy this, if you like more, drop me a line. Let me know. Share this with a friend. Share this with a student. This is a great introduction to the podcast. Catching up with all these, I think there was 18 guests, if my count is correct. So you can find all the complete interviews in the show notes for this episode. And again, share this with a friend, share this with a colleague, share this with a student. Thank you so much for tuning in to this special episode of the podcast, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.